But the more I put myself in Esme's position, the more awful I felt for her. I felt her fingers around mine, cold and slender, and her tender flesh reminded me that Esme had probably been through nearly as much agony as Edward and Bella. She had been domestically abused, or so it appeared, though she thankfully offered me no specifics. She had lost her sister to a violent homicide, and given refuge to her traumatized niece, and I was surrounded by so much despair and fear that it felt suffocating and made bile rise into my throat. It was never my desire or intention to bind myself to such damage. I was weary with endless attempts of penetrating barriers that always remained impervious. Between the three of them and Emmett alone, I just couldn't bear any more wounds. I feared I'd come undone before Edward. "I'm not that man," I replied in a strangled voice, and I could feel the blood rain from my face as I gazed into her eyes. She nodded in a swift bobbing motion.
"I know, I'm sorry,"
she replied hastily, appearing quite desperate, as she grasped my hand tightly.
"I had no idea that you wanted more, and maybe I was simply ignoring the signs for my own benefit, but I'm just sorry,"
she pleaded, leaning in closer and pulling my hand farther toward her body. I sat silent and expressionless, because I was never seeking an apology, and she stared at my blank gaze remorsefully for many moments. The waitress halted at our table with a bright smile I could see from my periphery, as she asked us if we were okay. We remained silent as I stared into her eyes, and the question suddenly seemed ridiculously meaningful as it lingered in the air between us. The waitress waited, standing in an awkward pose, and scrutinizing our locked gaze, before she quietly departed.
"I suppose I've never really considered marriage."
Esme pursed her lips thoughtfully, and I quirked an eyebrow, rather skeptical that she was suddenly showing an interest simply to pacify me. She seemed to be contemplating for many moments, biting the inside of her cheek, as she commonly did when in deep thought. And then her foot began to tap beneath the table, and I recognized the gesture as one she often did when forming substantial decisions. Finally, her foot stopped, and her pursed lips slowly curled up into a small smile.
"I wouldn't be entirely opposed to the concept."
She smiled with a gentle caress of her thumb in my hand. My eyes narrowed, and I might have called her out for lying. I might have told her I didn't believe it and I refused to remain trapped in a dead-end relationship for 3 more years, while she strung me along shamelessly. I might have told my trust required more than just her audible musings. But her eyes and smile were curiously bright, as she spoke and lightly grasped my hand in her acquiescence. She wasn't distant, and she didn't pull away, and suddenly I felt a swelling of hope that I could get through one barrier in this mess of troubled individuals. If I could make progress with Esme, then surely I had hope for Edward as well. I needed the hope her committal granted me. I had been devoid of it for so long that I was irrationally willing to give her another chance, and find faith that she would be proof that my love and persistence accomplished something. I couldn't deny my skepticism still, but if I refused, then I was no better than her, harboring old pain and doubt, and allowing it to affect my present and future. Cullen was never a hypocrite. But even if she were being sincere and willing, there were still 2 people in this world who I'd never hesitate to put before my desire for her, because they were my family first. And though she and Emmett could get along swimmingly. "Edward?" I asked stiffly, while my hand lay limply in hers. If she meant to deepen her commitment to me, Edward would be involved. And so would Bella. She exhaled deeply, darting her eyes away from mine with a grimace, and I instinctively knew that whatever barrier we had just reached was unrelated to her issues with him. "Tell me," I ordered while retrieving my hand, because this was the moment for genuine honesty. I had to know her justification for being so resolute on her position against Edward and Bella's relationship. Esme's eyes shifted to my withdrawn hand, as she frowned and leaned back into her booth seat.
"Renee,"
she whispered in an utterly defeated tone, and her fingers began fidgeting once again with her shirt hem in her lap.
"Bella reminds me so much of Renee some days. They were completely differently, of course, but so alike in their ambitions and independence. It was one of the things I always admired about her." She smiled down at her lap, and it was sad and wistful yet again. She could never speak of her sister without becoming emotional, and I braced myself for her tears. She met my gaze again, and I was momentarily stunned that I saw no tears, only a silently ruling bitterness. "But Renee had a flaw." She always fell head over heels for the wrong men. Usually, they were just dependent or boring, but sometimes...
He paused and glanced at me with an anxious expression as her fingers continued their ministrations on her shirt hem.
Sometimes they were troubled, and her compassion and curiosity blinded her, and that flaw killed her.
Her voice lowered to a nervous whisper as she bowed her head.
If Bella ever allowed...
What exactly are you insinuating? I cut her off in an angry sneer, downright infuriated at the direction of her explanation, and daring her to admit her own assumption aloud in my presence. I'd leave the table, and this diner, and this whole damn town behind if she ever did. She avoided my gaze as I seated and clenched my fist under the table, and I realized she wouldn't say it. Coward. You mean to compare my son to a deranged sociopathic murderer? I spat at her as more of a statement than an inquiry, because clearly she was. Much in the same way she meant to compare me to an abusive misogynist. I fought to ignore the fact that it was the first time I had ever verbally referred to Edward as my son. She blanched at my tone, and her eyes widened as she finally gathered the courage to look me in the face.
No, I just don't know him, Carlisle, and...
She hastily defended herself as my teeth ground together and restrained from launching a particularly vulgar string of Edward-approved profanities.
Can you honestly tell me you know him? Really know him?
She asked in a low and suggestive voice. Yes. I answered without hesitation. He'd never know where I paused, and shook my head, because it was simply too appalling to even think. I can't even finish that statement, because it is utterly insulting to even speak the words. I looked away, bitter and angry at Esme, yet again.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to imply.
She whispered after a few moments of tense silence. I took another drink of my coffee, to occupy my hem. But you did. You're doing it again with him, and it's hardly fair. He's done nothing to deserve such assumptions. I paused when I noticed her arched eyebrow and pointed glance. I rolled my eyes in exasperation at her skeptical expression. Please, Esme. He's been arrested twice for minor offenses. I alluded to his commonly known criminal history and, shamefully, downplayed the drug offenses. And if this is about the sex, how many teenage boys and girls their age do the same thing? How often do you suppose Alice and Jasper?
Carlisle.
She interrupted with a panicked expression, before I could imply that her own daughter was sexually active. I did prescribe her birth control, after all. She visibly relaxed when I retired my defense, and her face softened.
I know, it's a double standard, and it isn't fair to Bella. I'm sorry.
She apologized once more, and it was frustrating. I didn't want an apology, I wanted to see action. She pleaded with her eyes once more, as she leaned closer again.
I just couldn't. If anything happened to her because I was being negligent, it would kill me.
Her face grew grave and darkened, and I really did understand her fierce need to protect Bella. But she was going above and beyond her call of duty. She continued with heavy sigh.
There isn't a handbook here, Carlisle. I'm doing the best I can, and still, it isn't enough.
She appeared desperate and exhausted, as she shifted her gaze to her lap, and I figured she truly felt lost. And I knew the sensation of failure and loss, because I had felt it with Edward for so long. It wasn't my place, and I was certainly no expert in parenting or blended families, but my judgment wasn't being clouded by her personal extenuating circumstances. I somehow felt as though my guidance could be appreciated. Maybe you're being negligent right now by treating her like an incapable infant. I fought to keep my voice calm and failed as her eyes rose to mine and widened. I hated being harsh with Esme, but I'll be damned if she didn't need it. Her hair tilted to the side and her brows frowned as I continued. Do you honestly think Bella would go through such an ordeal, and put herself in the position to be harmed so carelessly? I asked, raising my eyebrows expectantly. Esme slowly shook her head and pursed her lips again, appearing quite interested in my opinion, as her attention clearly piqued. I nearly snorted. If she had been this interested months ago, we could have avoided so much undue turmoil. I proceeded while leaning closer to her face over the table, obliged to be beneficial for once. Wouldn't you agree that, even though she requires special attention, her judgment hasn't been damaged in any way? I asked knowingly. If anything, Bella was a better judge of character than most as a result of her tribulations. As expected, Esme shook her head, still thoughtful in consideration of these truths. And then I had to add my final thought at her defeat, even though I knew it would upset her greatly. I inhaled deeply, and prepared myself for a river of tears as I spoke my final question in a low and remorseful voice. Would Renee react to the situation in this manner? The car was warm, dark, and comfortable as I pulled out of the diner, and I felt lighter. It was more freeing than the night I had left Esme, because this time I had done something constructive. She broke down as I had anticipated, and though I felt awful for upsetting her, I didn't regret the progress she made. I could see it in her eyes as she surrendered to the realization that she had been wrong. Not exactly wrong, per se, but she allowed her overwhelming emotions to drive her actions, and now it was up to her to mend the relationships she had destroyed. Ours and theirs. And she would, because even though her hurdle with Bella was higher than her own, she wasn't capable of bearing the possibility of disappointing her sister. So I would do my best to assist her in finding the right balance with both relationships. As I drove home in undeniable relief, I began making strategies of lists and requirements for these new circumstances. Esme would need to grow closer to Edward and observe what I had on his birthday between the two. They would need to act responsibly and placate her fears by remaining less dependent. He would need to gain her trust, and I could only pray he wouldn't ruin the opportunity to return to her good graces. I smiled as I realized he would probably do just about anything to be with Bella. I would still persist in my secondary instinct to pull them aside and educate them on the proper way to conduct their relationship given their special circumstances. And perhaps once this had all settled down, Esme and I could convince Bella and Edward to seek treatment for at the very least their sleeping problems. It was nearly 9 as I pulled into the drive, and the house looked hardly darker. I had spent most of my day at the hospital, and my homecoming was delayed by my meeting with Esme, which ended up being nearly 3 hours long. As I parked and exited the car, the soft glow of the living room lights illuminated the yard and made the path to the dark porch slightly visible. I found as I approached the door and wiped my feet. It wasn't considerate not to leave the porch light on when they both knew I would be arriving after dusk. The house was silent as I entered, and closed the door behind me still, somewhat dark. I furrowed my brows curiously and deposited my bag in the foyer before making my way up the first flight of stairs, flipping light switches as I ascended. I was honestly rather excited to speak to Edward about the evening's events. I wanted to inform him on proper behavior in front of Esme and see the smile on his face when I told him we were invited for dinner the following day with both her and Bella. We all needed the deviation from the now common glum and tense atmosphere of the two households. As I approached the second flight of stairs, something crunched under my feet. I stepped back and inspected the broken picture frame in confusion. Deciding it had fallen off of the wall, I began picking up the broken shards of glass and tossed it in the second-floor bathroom's trash can before continuing up the stairs to Edward's room. When I reached the silent hallway that led to his door, I flicked on the light and frowned once again. He hadn't left his room since the sunset. It wasn't particularly uncommon, so I didn't think much of it as I approached his door and knocked softly. The door was just ajar enough that my knock pushed it open, and I felt nervous about entering without express verbal permission. I eventually decided, as I peeked into the black sliver the open door created, that my news would be enough to distract him from my intrusion. Tentatively, I pushed the door open and used my hand to seek out the light switch to turn it on. When my fingers found the switch and flipped it, my jaw slowly dropped in horror as I gazed bewildered into the large room before me. It was utter destruction. There were clothes and papers scattering the floor so haphazardly that the gold carpet was barely visible. Holes and scuffs littered the walls as I stepped inside, and my foot suddenly met the overturned black leather couch. My eyes widened at the sight as I stepped around it. As my gaze absorbed more, I realized the bookshelf had been overturned as well, and was now lying completely flat on the floor face down, books strewn across the perimeter randomly. And the bed was ravaged, and the sheets bore distinguishable and ragged rips, as they frayed and spilled onto the cluttered floor and revealed the pale blue mattress beneath. My first instinct upon seeing the mangled wreckage was immediate alarm and concern. I was dumbfounded, worried, angry, and Edward was nowhere in sight. I checked the bathroom